Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome, Kate. Very excited about this. Unfortunately, today we will be missing Rick due to personal reasons. He'll be back on the next one. Kate, as is custom with CareOps webinars, we start with an icebreaker question before you introduce yourself. Then I'll intro myself as well for the people who don't know me, and then we'll get into your amazing keynote. And so the question is, what book or books do you most often recommend to people and why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I right now am obsessed with Annie Duke and her decision-making framework. And I don't, the books have been around for a long time, but I recently got a chance to take her Maven course earlier this year. And so I've been really enjoying and talking a lot with people in my network around about her books, which are Making Better Decisions and Thinking in Bets. And actually a lot of her approach to decision-making is we've woven through how we work at Avela. And so you'll hear a lot of Annie Duke isms and strategizing in my talk today.
Cool. Well, I love their first book. I haven't read any other of them. And by the way, at Avela, we use something called, we follow the Shape Up product methodology, which also involves betting tables, right? So the vernacular around placing bets and, hitting certain outcomes is ingrained in the company as well. I've tried to implement that as well in my family. If we need to make big decisions, so we've been, relocating to the US and doing like big shifts with the family. And but it's not easy outside of a business context to use her decision framework because the words are complex to understand for kids.
The sauna tasks, not appreciated.
Great. I also just read this really crazy book called Longitude, which is about the search for the device to help explorers in the 17th, 18th century to explore the world and to not miss the island or the shore there or the destination that they were aiming for. It's again one of those stories that is stranger than fiction. So absolutely recommend it. It's called Longitude. So really great book.
Great. I'll have to add it to my Goodreads.
Cool. Good. So let's get this started. Kate, I would love for you to first start by introducing yourself, your background, and then I'll do that as well, and then we'll kick it off with your keynote.
Okay, sounds great. Well, hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Kate Monti. I am a co-founder and the president at Avela Health. Avela is a autism services provider that uses technology to embed autism services in the home for families. Prior to that, I was the COO of Health, which is a venture-backed company that focused on building digital substance use disorder treatment. And so Workit has been around for about 10, 15 years now, and really just has followed an incredible journey of expanding access to substance use disorder care and saving a lot of lives. So it was really a pleasure and privilege to be a part of that team. And then prior to that, I have a master's degree in social work and public health. Both of them focused on how we can use technology and innovation to make it easier for humans to adopt health behaviors. I grew up with a family that had a lot of chronic health conditions throughout it, and had an opportunity to see digital enhancement and innovation in the diabetes space and the Parkinson's space. And I think always felt a bit confused about why we weren't seeing similar innovation in the behavioral health space, right? Why couldn't we do for mental health conditions what we do for diabetes? And so it's been just really fun to spend the last 15 years focusing on how we can use similar ways of thinking and similar technologies to make a difference in those spaces. And yeah, just excited to be here and talk more about it.
Yeah, love the background. The diverse set of companies and a great, foundation to do the work you're doing. So looking forward to that. So my name's Thomas, co-founder and CEO at AWell, and also co-author at CareOps. So for the audience, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. Kate will go through her keynote, but where possible, we will intersperse with some relevant questions. And so don't hesitate to post your questions in there, and we'll try to get them all answered. So with that, Kate, please, you can kick it off.
Let me just share my screen. Can you see it big, or is it like in a small square?
It's in a small square at the moment, yeah.
Let me do it one more. I'll share the Chrome tab instead. I think that should fix it. Okay, how's that?
It's a bit bigger. I think it's good.
Okay, all right, we'll run on this, and if we need to, we'll share it after. So I think that's great. Well, I'll kick off. So hello, everyone. I already introduced myself, so I won't do it again, but it really is a pleasure to be here and specifically to be talking about improving care daily. I have to admit, I was a little bit intimidated by the description of this this keynote, but I think I'm really excited to share some of what I've learned over the course of my my work and what I found helpful and unhelpful. And so I'll jump right in. And I think, you know, the place I wanted to start when I was thinking about how to frame improving care daily is to talk a little bit about what it's been like to try to crack that nut for myself. And so I think the area I wanted to start was just talking about how I have always been obsessed with outcomes throughout my whole operations career. I've always started from a place of, you know, this is what I want to create. This is the result I want. How do I get there? And I think we see this in the space really like all the time, right? There are headlines constantly that I'm clicking on that say things like how this company scaled to 100 million in revenue, or how this company cut their time to first appointment by 70%. And we're just a group that's very obsessed with results, right? Whether a company IPOs or achieves profitability, what your annual revenue is. And what I spent a lot of time and honestly frustration on was seeking out roadmaps that would guarantee results like those headlines, right? How do I find someone who can tell me how to get to that result, that can guarantee that I'll get to that revenue or IPO? And what I never heard anyone say, and I sort of had to conclude myself, was that there is no playbook that guarantees those results. It doesn't exist, right? There's no mystical Sherpa who can guide me to the top of Everest and guarantee I won't get frostbite or a sprained ankle along the way, right? That just doesn't happen. And I'm disappointed. I wish there was, but I found that he doesn't exist.
That's a very stark opening for this webinar.
Yeah. I use the mountain metaphor a lot in my own head. I'm like, just tell me how to get to the top of this mountain, whether that's capacity planning or, you know, company building, that sort of thing. How can I guarantee I don't mess up? And I think the reality is that results aren't created by chasing them, right? We don't actually get to 100 million in revenue by like focusing on getting to 100 million in revenue, right? It's sort of the wrong way to think about it. And I think that's true for improving care daily. We don't get to improving care daily by talking about improving care daily per se, right? We get there by making decisions and also luck, right? A little bit of luck every day, right? Every day we make decisions that end up concluding in care being shaped as sort of a byproduct of those decisions or an end result. And what I think is so interesting about those decisions is that they're made but we're not really necessarily tracking the decisions themselves, right? No one's logging a decision in Jira per se or charting it in Epic, right? Our favorite comment is if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. But we're really bad at documenting decisions themselves, right? And how we made them and why we made them. We focus on the result and then decide if the decision was good or bad and sort of forget the process that went into making or concluding that decision. And so I think like the thing I want you to take away from this dialogue, right, is that improving care isn't about knowing exactly what to do. It isn't about knowing the result and exactly how to get there. There's no silver bullet workflow. There's no playbook. There's no answer I can give you that's going to have you leave this and be like, I know exactly how to do it. But really, instead, it's about building a culture that helps teams make better decisions that they're making together, that they're making consistently, and that they're learning from, right? And using that learning to drive the next decision. And if you can get that right, if you can build a culture that has strong decision-making muscles, care will get better, right? Care will get better. It's inevitable, right? You can't avoid improvement when you're focusing on good decision-making quality and learning from those decisions. And so that is, I would say, like the drumbeat of the culture that we are trying to build at Avela. And I'll give you today some more tools and tips on how we're really working to embed that into what we're doing here.
Oh, love it.
Great. I'm going to skip my intro since I've already done it, but this is me. It's very nice to be here. And I've also talked a little bit about Avela already, right? We are an autism services provider that's using technology to really build a family-centered intervention. But I'm not really here to talk about the care model per se. I'm here to talk about the operating system driving that model. So you can learn more about us on our website or through our social media, but really, I think it's the operational engine that's driving that I'm excited to share more about. And so when I started to work with Avela, this concept of CareOps and CareOps culture came up, and I was so excited by it because it gave language to a concept that I had felt for a long time, right? It gave a terminology to this idea of CareOps, right? Of how we do the work and how we build a culture around doing that work well. And I think, CareOps is more than a toolkit or a set of processes, right? It is a culture. And it's a culture that creates a shared language, a shared vision, a shared direction across the entire organization. And that doesn't mean you've built a culture that always wins. It doesn't mean that you create a culture that always has the right end result. It means you've created one that learns how to decide, how to experiment, and how to adapt, right, over time. And I think that's what CareOps does really well, right? It helps you become decision literate as a team. Instead of making a decision and focusing on the outcome, you learn to find that the decision itself was the area to dive into and focus. And CareOps culture, a culture that's constantly focusing on learning, adapting, and improving, and we'll see this in the life cycle as we talk about it, like those types of areas are what are going to drive your overall improvement in outcomes. And so CareOps, I describe it as the set of practices and tools, but the culture of CareOps is really more about the values, beliefs, and attitudes, right, that underpin the processes that we put in place. And so I like this phrasing of like, it's the water in which we swim, right? It's how we make decisions. I always think of decisions, every decision is a mini trust fall, right? And we're going to make dozens and dozens of mini trust falls every day as a team. And so how can we build a culture that supports those trust falls and allows us to lean through them and create a better outcome?
I love this concept of trust fall. I've heard you use it before, Kate. Can you explain a bit what it is, a trust fall?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think I think probably people know literally, right? It's this idea, like it's often done in like team building exercises when you all go out to a wilderness camp and you're like trying to build rapport, right? Where one person stands in front, the other person stands behind, and you like literally fall backwards, right? And you're falling and you're trusting the person behind you to catch you. And there's a lot that goes into that trust, right? Is that person paying attention? Are they strong enough to catch me? Am I falling in a straight way? There's all of these micro decisions going into it, but inherently you have to trust the person behind you to receive, right, what's coming from you. And as a team, right, we do that all day, every day, right? My chief clinical officer has to trust my decisions, right? And I have to trust her input when I'm making decisions and vice versa. And so all day long, right, every time we make a decision, even if we're making a decision that in theory is one that doesn't require a lot of coordination, right? That is a trust fall from everyone in the organization saying, hey, I trust you to catch this. I trust you to do that. And in order to do that, in order to trust the person behind you, you kind of have to know them. You have to know that like, you're aligned on the vision of the trust fall. You're aligned on the outcome, the desired outcome. And you're aligned when, that trust fall is not going to work. And you say, hey, don't fall. I'm stepping out of the way. Right. So I think that it's a good analogy for all of the different micro ways we reinforce our team dynamics, as we make decisions. And so here are some examples of the cultural backbones that we try to use as sort of a drumbeat to keep our teams focused on alignment and trust and relationship building. I won't read them all, but I'll read a couple of them that I think have stuck out to me or have been really important in my journey. And so I think the first one that I like to focus on is an attitude of good intent. I think especially when you're building a company that's really hard and it's so easy to look at results and be like, this is so frustrating. It's not working. We're all trying really hard, but like, why isn't it working? It's very easy to start sort of like building up frustration and resentment internally, right? And it's so easy to fall into like, well, that person's just trying to be hard or difficult or get in the way or stop us from moving forward. And I think for me, I've had to really like embody an attitude of good intent, right? I've had to tell myself, we are on the same side of this problem. We both want the same outcomes. The friction we're experiencing is not because someone is trying to be difficult, but because they're seeing it from a different point of view as me. And how can we get on the same side of that? This is something operations and marketing tend to experience a lot of friction in, at least in my experiences, because often marketing is trying to push volume. Their goal is to get as many people in the door as possible. And operations job is to like keep the boat steady, right? And have enough capacity to absorb that growth. And usually I found that like one is we use the term in the hot seat, right? You either have so much demand you can't absorb it, and operations feeling really frustrated and against the gun, or the opposite, right? You have all of this capacity and marketing's feeling really frustrated. I've had to spend a lot of time building relationships with my marketing team, be like, hey, we ultimately want the same thing. How can we work together to get there? So an attitude of good intent has been really important to me. The other one I'll call out is build for forever. I think the venture space has been very, very volatile and interesting and dynamic over the last 15 years. I think we all know and probably appreciate the fundraising energies and how they've ebbed and flowed. And so I think one of the areas that I've really doubled down on as a value system for our team and our company is how can we make sure that we're building in a way that's sustainable, not just now, not until the next fundraise, not until, the next financial milestone, but really long term. And so we've had a laser focus on profitability from the very beginning, because we know how difficult it can be when you've built an incredible model that can go nowhere, right? Kind of a bridge to nowhere. And so building for forever, I think, is another one that really sticks out for me.
To what extent is this informed by your prior experience?
Yeah, I think in both of my sort of like fast growing company experiences, I've built in very different times, right? So Work at Health was founded in 2015, and really I think like grew during the boom cycle, right? I think raised all the way through our Series C, right? We were growing very quickly. It was a time where cash and capital were very cheap, and the idea was sort of like just grow as fast as you can, right? And I think there were some real beautiful opportunities that came out of that, right? We were able to get care into the hands of so many people. We started Workit when the concept of what Workit was doing was very nascent. It wasn't well understood. Like telehealth was like kind of understood, but not really. And so like we created a new paradigm, right? We created a new way of delivering care that I think did not really exist prior to its existence, along with a couple of other really important and incredible companies that were doing similar things. And at the same time, building in that dynamic allows you to kind of minimize or ignore things that aren't actually sustainable, right? You're like, well, eventually we'll figure that out. Eventually we'll, like on the priority list, we'll get to that. And I think that, some of the most challenging moments in my career have been moments where like I've had to pay the piper and been like, oh, I don't know how to solve that problem, right? And now I'm not in a position where I can kind of ignore it any longer. And so in terms of Avela, we've entered the company building at a time where the opposite is true. Cash is very hard to come by. There aren't very big fundraisers happening in digital health. And so we've been forced to think through, what are some of the problems that we had to really reckon with in our previous experiences, and how can we get ahead of them now? How can we make sure we're solving for those much earlier in the tenure of the business? And so when we're building this culture of alignment, right, I always think of this as like, does everyone know where we're going? And is everyone aligned on what the end result should or could look like, right? I think a lot of times the divisions in culture come from differences in point of view on the end result, right? On where we're going. And again, as I mentioned, it's not like, I don't think it's helpful to laser focus on the end result, but I do think it's helpful to make sure that everyone is rowing in the same direction, right? That everyone is aligned on the vision, right? If someone thinks that like, we're going to be a 3-state company that's going to like, be like moderately large and like just kind of like ebb and flow private practice style, and another person thinks we're going to IPO in 3 or 5 years, like we've got real differences in how we're going to make decisions to get to that end result. And so there's a couple of tools that we've used really early on in Avela that I think have helped get everyone aligned on the vision and direction of the business, right? And so this is one of them. It's called a hot air balloon exercise. And it is something that you can do in a group, and you just ask everyone personally, like individually, to answer these questions, right? So you say, like, imagine the company is a hot air balloon, right? And these are all of the different forces, right, that can affect where our hot air balloon goes in the universe, right? And so you have wind, which are external forces. You have sandbags, which are internal challenges that we might face. Hot air, what are the strengths of our organization? What gives us a competitive advantage? So you can have everyone go through this exercise of kind of what are all of the things that you're working through or that are affecting where we end up as a business. And then it creates an opportunity to have a really productive discussion on key differences, right? What someone might perceive as a sandbag, someone else might not, right? Or what someone thinks is a strength, someone else might think is a vulnerability. And it creates an opportunity to get away from resulting from kind of like the bias of we've all kind of concluded the same thing, but don't actually really think that. And it creates an opportunity to have really interesting and important discussions around just where in general the company is going and what it might face along the way. Similarly, we try to get everyone really aligned on the why, right? And this is Simon Sinek, and like he's obviously like very well known, so I won't talk too much about it, right? But I think like, again, especially in operations and in product and the nuts and bolts of how companies get made, we love to focus on the how and what, right? Like, what are we building? How are we building it? Like, and it's so easy to get just so lost in what and how you're building that you forget why you were building it in the first place. Like, there have been really helpful moments where my co-founder will be like, Kate, I need you to stop talking about what you're building and tell me why you're still doing it. And it's been like, like there have been some humbling moments where I'm like, I've lost the thread. I actually don't know. You're right. I don't know why we're still doing this. This is not aligned with our why, right? With what we're trying to do as a business. And so it's been really helpful to use that as like a leadership point to be like, wait, why are you still focusing on this? And does this directly relate back to the why of the business and what we're trying to accomplish? And so really early on at Avela, we spent a whole section of our like kind of first all hands talking about what our why was, and then using that as a way to kind of augment and redirect when we seem like we've lost maybe a little bit of why we're doing what we're doing.
How granular does your why go? Do you have it for every decision that you need to make?
I think that's a good question. I think it's contextual. I think it happens. I would say it comes up more when we're talking about like larger scale initiatives, right? Where there's a bigger risk of kind of deviating from this like core value proposition of like where we're going. But I actually do think it comes up. I'm trying to think of an example more recently where our team is dealing with calendar woes, which I'm sure is something that a lot of people here have dealt with, where there's no perfect calendar system out there that does exactly what we're doing. And that like, so we got really in the weeds on like, well, here are 5 different calendar systems that none of them are perfect. And we were spending a lot of time like testing them, triaging them, chatting with their support teams. And there was a moment where I think actually just this week where my director of operations, who might be in this call with actually listening, and I were sitting there and we were kind of like, does this actually matter? Like, why are we doing this, right? Like the end result of this initiative is to get people into this session. Like there's not a large number of people that need to be managed. There is a manual way we could do this. Like no system's going to be perfect. Like why are we spending all of our time on this? And it was I think a helpful moment for her and I to be like, okay, like we can put this down. We can put this down and just like pick an easier way and move forward. We're getting a little paralyzed in the decision itself. And so the last thing I wanted to talk about in this sort of like culture of alignment section is this exercise that I actually did in the Maven course with Annie Duke that I thought was really transformational in how I think about communicating with my teams. And it's called a words of probability exercise. And the reason this is helpful is because one of the risks of working together in a group is ambiguity and expectations, right? And especially this is such a risk because when we're ambiguous, it can lead to misunderstandings which degrade trust, right? Well, I thought you said that it was certain that we would get this outcome. Well, I thought that when I said yes to this, I thought there was no chance, right, that this would go badly or there was no risk, right? And so this exercise is a really interesting one to do. You can Google it and find it online, but it basically asks everyone in the group to take a moment and look at all of these terms on the left. So they're terms like frequently or certainly or probably, and assign a probability percentage, right? So when I say frequently, what do I mean? I mean 70% of the time, right? That's sort of my proxy for like, when I say frequently, that's what I mean. And you do this in an isolated silo, like you do it yourself, and then you share it across the group. And the results will be very surprising, right? The results shocked me candidly. So this on the left here, this is actually the exercise I did with my peer group, right? And I highlighted some of the ones that were most surprising. So often, right, I had said 70%, another person said 50. I feel like that's like a very large variance in what we mean when we say often. Usually 80% to 60%, and unlikely, so a span of 20% to 50%. And what's shocking is those are probably the three ambiguous terms I use the most. So like for them to be the ones that have the largest spread really was telling me that, oh, when I'm communicating with a group, I need to be much clearer and more specific on what I mean, what I say often, etc. And I think these are words we fall into, like I call it lazy language. Like they're terms we fall into all the time, but are it's such a helpful way to understand, oh, when we're working together in a group, we need to be more specific about what we're talking about when we think about what we're building or doing.
Yeah, I love this. I also, it's striking that person two thinks always is still a 95 instead of 100. That just goes to show. And for the audience, just pasted the link there. There's this really interesting study that actually shows that spread, right? And so as you can imagine, at the extremes, the spread is pretty small, right? Like the always or the never. People are relatively aligned on that, but in the middle, that's in the gray zone, you can have actually a lot of spread in these likelihoods. So I love this exercise.
Yeah, it's crazy how much it's changed my thinking. Also, we had a long debate around how always could not be 100% because I also just was like, no, that's not how my brain works. But it just goes to show, right? It really underlines the point, I think, actually. And so like what are the benefits, right? And I think these probably go without saying a bit, but right, like I think when we the underpinnings, when we build a culture that's focused on developing team alignment and trust, an openness to exploration and a testing mindset, comfort with innovation and iteration, and reducing friction in how we make decisions, right? All of those things, like if I could, like they all come down to trusting the people around you and like a willing that enables and greases our ability to make decisions quickly and iterate on them. Then we observe the results that we're desperate to seek, right? We observe faster decision making, right? We observe improved clinical practices and patient outcomes, more operational efficiency, and engaged teams. Because at the end of the day, we're all very motivated, right? And we're almost excited by the opportunity for us to all work towards getting to that why together and trusting that we're going to make mistakes along the way, but that our decision making processes will guide us through that. All right. And so then so say we've nailed it, right? And the secret is you'll never nail it. It won't happen. I haven't nailed it. Every day I have to remind myself of one of the values I'm not living. Like we won't figure it out. But once we've developed that culture, we feel like we have alignment on why, where we're going, et cetera. How do you actually make the decisions, right? Because it's one thing to say like, okay, we're all aligned on where we're going, but you do actually have to make a decision, right? And decision paralysis can be so difficult to overcome, right? So how do we decide actually what we're going to do or where we're going to go? And here, there's a couple of frameworks that I have found really helpful in cutting through the noise to making a decision or concluding with a decision. And so the first is this sort of decision-making Venn diagram that we use. And there's three areas that we ask ourselves, are we meeting the need? Or like, should we do this decision, right? Should we move forward with this plan, right? And so there's three questions we ask ourselves. One, is it desirable? Do our members want what we're suggesting that we do or build, right? Like, how does this relate to what the end user, client, member, customer is looking for, right? And then we try to tie that to a metric, something concrete and measurable. So for us, we look at retention and NPS, right? If we've built something someone wants, they will use it. We'll see them retained week over week, and they'll tell us through our NPS that they like it, right? Those are the measures that we look at for desirability. Then we look at viability and feasibility. Is what we're building sustainable and will it scale, right? And so we measure that through operating margin and LTV to CAC, right? Which is lifetime value versus or over customer acquisition cost, right? So are people staying with us long enough that we can generate a healthy margin to run, like to continue to offer this to the client? And are we generating a long enough retention period, right, to justify the investment we're putting into bringing this to market? And then finally, clinical efficacy, are members achieving their goals? At Avela, we use something called goal attainment scaling, and then we also look at attendance, because we believe that if people are showing up and engaging, and our product is built on good clinical evidence, then their clinical outcomes will improve as well. So we look at clinical outcomes over time, but then also just weekly attendance in terms of, are they consuming the content we believe will result in good clinical outcomes? And so in this framework, right, we ask ourselves these 3 questions anytime we want to do something, and in a macro and micro way, right? Because even what forms we put in front of a family before an appointment, it can, is relevant to all of these things, right? Does it affect our ability to understand clinical outcomes? Do members want it, or are we going to lose people because we're asking them to do too much before the first appointment? And is it sustainable to ask for this amount of information up front consistently, right? What tools are we going to use? Like, how's that going to work? So we have found this to be a really helpful lens to understand if something is worth investing in or not.
Can you go maybe a bit deeper into either this example that you just brought or another one, and explicitly maybe one that created some friction between these 3 circles?
That's a good question. Yeah. One of them is, I'm trying to think of a good example. I think the best one actually is we've been working a lot on understanding areas that we have been generally passionate about, right? Because we're nerds who obviously are obsessed with what we're doing, which is why we started a company in it. And I think, when you come into company building, you have all of these ideas about what will be interesting or fun to build, right? And the reality is sometimes you have to ask yourself if am I building this because it's actually relevant, or because I just personally think it's a really cool, interesting thing. And so we have this group model that we've been talking about, how does it fit into the broader Avela clinical context, right? So we do a lot of one-on-one care, we do a lot of asynchronous care, we do offer groups, but there was specifically this group concept that we had around this idea we have called the theory of change, which is sort of the framework we think families would thrive within, right? If you can kind of get these concepts into people's lives, their lives will get better. And we all were obsessed with the theory of change. We thought it was very cool. We talked about it all the time. We tried to spin up multiple internal groups around it that struggled to take off. But we couldn't let it go. And we couldn't let it go because it was something we thought was going to be monumental before Avela, when it was just an idea in our heads. And so there was this we're putting a lot of resources into building it. And at the end of the day, when we looked at the data, we were having a really hard time getting people to show up. I mean, unsurprisingly, families are busy. They have kids. When are they going to go to this synchronous group around this topic that's kind of interesting, but not life or death, It was hard to scale because we had to have enough times for people to show up, but not enough times to be operationally inefficient. It was tough to find a model that was really going to work. And our members were meeting their goals without them. We were seeing good clinical outcomes without them. And so if I'm being honest, we weren't really nailing it on any of these 3, but we didn't stop. We kept pushing it. We took a lot of my co-founders' time, a lot of my time. And it was actually until we kind of said wait, we had to have sort of a reckoning moment where we're not actually nailing it on any of these. We need to put it down. And I think that decision was still hard. It was still sad, right? Because I think it was such a core part of what we thought Avela would be, that it was, even though we knew that we had this framework and we knew it was the right framework, we kind of still wanted to ignore it and do it anyway. And so it was tough. It was really tough.
So what you're saying is that there's actually this shadow circle that's not on the diagram, that is, how badly do you personally or as a group want something, and that it's messing with the 3 circles that actually matter. That's kind of the lesson here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Sometimes you can really just want something to exist, and that doesn't unfortunately mean that it should exist. And so the other framework that I love to talk about are OKRs. And again, I feel these are something that are probably widely understood, so I won't spend too much time talking about OKRs, but specifically the aspect of OKRs that I want to talk about is the cascade, because I feel this is sort of the most opportunity for misalignment, but also an area where you can create a lot of synergy and fast decision-making when you're well aligned. And so an objective is a goal. A key result is the metric used to evaluate that goal. Key initiatives are the work that kind of generate that key results to help you meet the objective. So sort of the loose framework. But the cascade is I'm obsessed with, right? Which is the idea that your entire company's OKR structure or KPI structure, I think this actually works for KPIs as well, should cascade from the overall company objective. And every OKR your team has should be able to be tied all the way back up to the top, right? And so it creates a lot of horizontal and vertical alignment. And so when you do an OKR cascade, right, you start with your company kind of mission and vision, and then that translates into this year's kind of company objective. So in this example, we're looking at revenue. And then from there, you'll set several key results towards that objective, right? And so you may have a new member acquisition goal, which is going to be how you achieve that revenue objective. You can then cascade all of the team's OKRs down from that, right? So in order to achieve our new member acquisition goal, right, what are some of the things our teams are going to have to focus on? Well, we're going to need to make sure we have enough capacity to bring those members in. We're going to need to make sure the sign-up flow is frictionless so that families can actually get in and convert. And we're going to need to make sure we're limiting as many barriers to that first appointment as possible, right? And so as you can see, then you can kind of continue to cascade down and get more and more specific into the team specific objectives. But again, right, like it's very easy if you sit down and you say, like, I'm going to set my operations team's OKRs. I can think of like 15 things that I would love to do that I can't directly tie back to the team, the overall company mission and objectives, right? Maybe they're important or interesting or helpful in some way, but like I can't make the line straight and clear, right? I can't. And then they probably shouldn't be OKRs, not for this quarter at least, right? Or maybe not even for this year. And so we found OKR frameworks and like really driving, not just having them, not just looking at them quarterly, but like really like in our language, constantly asking ourselves, like, are we aligned, right? Are we aligned vertically? Are we aligned horizontally? Like, is what I'm doing directly related to an OKR or a goal that ties back to the company's overall mission and objectives? That's helped us also cut through some of the noise in terms of how we're able to make decisions, right? On like, should we invest? Should we adapt? Should we kill, right? Like, how should we think about if this is something we should be working on? And again, like my operations team does this all the time. I'm trying to think of an example that's been most recent, but we've spent a ton of time on how we could like create efficiency between systems and like, could one system talk to the other, and like we see this desire for like deep integration, right? And like all of the systems talking to one another. And so I like spent a lot of time thinking about like, how do I get all of my systems like API integrated and communicating with one another? And like, that's a great vision, right? That's a great like direction to go. Like, I think in theory, right, it makes a lot of sense. And actually, like, I couldn't tie it. Like, it wasn't going to help us reach our revenue objective, right? Not this year. It wasn't going to help us like maintain our cost objective. It was actually going to cost more resources. And I wasn't even sure, when I was honest with myself, that the systems that I was building were going to be the right ones in a year anyway, right? And so I actually like undid a lot of our like optimization objectives for this year because they weren't directly tied to the company's objectives, and they probably would have been work of regret if I was being honest with myself in the long run. So I think that's an example that comes to mind for me and how I've used our OKR framework.
Cool. I read a while back opinion from someone who said that OKRs is a ploy from Google to stifle innovation in other organizations. Referring to how much effort it takes to write them down, to align on them. To your point, you could write down 100 OKRs every quarter for every team, every individual. And so could you give the audience like a feel of what effort you spent on that every quarter at Avela? Because, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I so badly wish that was true, because then I could ignore them and not do this. I wish I could be like, it's all a scam. We don't need goals. But I think this comes down to to good hygiene and good boundaries around them, right? I think you're right. It's so easy to fall into this like OKR hellhole where it's like all you're doing for weeks and weeks at a time. We limit every team to 3 or 4. So no one can have, they're just not going to be able to do more than that anyway, right? Like 3 or 4 is honestly like probably pushing it, if I'm being honest. I'd love every team to have 1 or 2. But we limit how many everyone has, first of all. Second of all, we use Asana. So we do just like a really simple OKR board, right? Like all the OKRs get loaded into Asana. Every month you update them to on track, at risk, off track. And then every quarter we do like how are we measuring the results and what is the result, right? And maybe then we'll use that to kind of reforecast Q2, but it really shouldn't take your team more than a couple of hours in a week or so to update your OKRs. If it's taking more time than that, you're spending more time on the process than you are on the actual goal or work itself. And I think that, to your point, it can be really distracting. And
what's the lead time to get to a set of written down and agreed OKRs for the companies? That a week, 2 weeks is longer? What is that?
Yeah, well, it probably depends on how busy my teams are in any given quarter, right? But I would like usually the way that we've run it is like week one will be like, we set the company top line vision, right? So like ELT says like, okay, like, are we still going where we're going, right? And disseminate that down to the teams, right? So this is where we're going. This is where we are. Week two, we ask the teams to generate their OKRs based on that vision, right? And then week three, we tie out alignment. So I would say like no more than 3 or 4 weeks, give or take, if I allow some due date slippage, but we try to keep it, relatively tight. Once you're a month into OKRs, you're a month into Q1, it's like so easy to let it slip away.
Exactly.
And then the last tool I wanted to leave you with in this area is a decision-making framework. Again, this is heavily borrowed from Annie, but it's something that we've been implementing in our very large decisions at Avela over the last couple of quarters that I think has been really helpful. And so there's a couple of risks that fall into working together in groups, right? The first thing that can happen is like early alignment bias, right? So the first person who speaks or the loudest voice in the room is the point of view everyone aligns on, right? And so when you're in a group, someone comes out with a really convicted, confident idea. And instead of having a discussion with different points of view, everyone starts to kind of align with that point of view. Like, well, that person sounds like they know what they're talking about, so let's do that. And that can really cut down on like productive discourse on if the decision is a good or bad one, right? Because we don't know if that person is making that decision using good or bad methodologies. The second is ambiguity, right? So a lot of we already talked about this a bit, but in groups, it's like very easy to say a lot and not say much at all. And so in group discourse, you can have this sort of degradation of actually being able to make a decision at the end of a conversation. And then the third is like leadership. I would call like leadership bias. So it's similar to number one, but it's sort of like the idea that everyone will listen to the person with the most authority in the group. When actually that person is often the least close to the actual work being done and should be the quietest, right? And should be the one speaking up the least. And so we've used this decision framework to kind of as like a pre-work to group meetings to cut down on the amount of discourse we have around the idea and just focus more on getting to alignment in a decision. And so there's a couple of different ways you can think about it, but the questions we use are pre-mortem. Imagine that implementing this idea has failed. What do you think went wrong? I think there's an interesting study that actually shows that ideas where you think about failure before you implement them are actually more likely to be implemented than when you don't think about failure at all. So we try to ask ourselves, like, what could go wrong? Backcasting, which is imagine that you're running this idea and it's been a resounding success. What made it work? Forecasting, what's your sense of profit? What is your probability that this will be a cost-effective and impactful decision? How valuable is it to achieving our goals? And then we usually call out our goals when we give this to people, and then make your argument. What's your strongest argument for why we should do this thing? And we do all of that beforehand. We share the results. And then when we come to a discussion, it's not about making your argument on why something should be done. We talk about points of difference. Like, why did you say it's 100% impactful to this year and you said it's 50? Let's discuss that specific difference and come to a conclusion. And then we walk out of a decision with multiple richer points of view, right? And the ability to discuss those differences and come to alignment versus just discussing the idea ad nauseum and then walking out being like, well, where did we end? What did we land on? So we found that to be really helpful as well. All right, I'm horribly over time, Thomas. I'm so sorry. So verbose, but the last, I'll wrap this part up here, which is just like, once you've worked on your culture, once you have frameworks to decide what to do, the last piece is just how do you actually do it, right? How do we actually go about implementing decisions in a way that falls in line with a continuous improvement methodology? And so this is a lovely, lovely resource that I actually work on and pull in for my teams quite a bit from Avela and CareOps. But every decision, once we've decided to do something, right? Every decision that goes into how that thing gets done, right, is a bet on the outcome, right? And we won't always know with certainty what is and isn't going to work. So a good example of this for us is we were trying to decide if we should expand our private pay market or not, right? So we're like, okay, do we expand our private pay market or do we not? We decided to expand it. And then there were a million decisions that had to be decided underneath that, right? Like, well, what states, what price, how often are people going to pay, right? Like all of those things. And all of those things, all of those decisions end up shaping the overall outcome, right, of the initiative. And so we made those decisions in ways that we tried to I'm trying to think of how to phrase it, right? We try to make small decisions with high learning potential, right? So it's like, okay, how do we make a decision in a way that tells us gives us the most insight in what we can learn, right? So we set some parameters very broad. We said if we operate in the most states we can, we will learn more, right? Than if we choose a smaller select market. And then we try to identify, like, how will we measure if that decision was successful as an outcome or unsuccessful as an outcome, right? So what will tell us if we invest more in this? Maybe signups take off, right? Maybe like it just blows up and there's like obviously a huge market of demand. Or when do we kill it, right? How do we know if it's been completely unsuccessful? Like, well, maybe no one signs up at all, and we're putting a lot of money and time into offering this service model, and it's not desirable, no one wants it. And so we used a lot of these frameworks, right? We tried to think through how do we implement this using a CareOps framework, right? So we love lucid charts. We did a lot of prototyping in lucid charts. What will the flow look like? How will we know like when people are dropping off or on? How can we change that? We built our onboarding care flow in Avela, which is a tool that gives us a lot of customization of the care flow. We wanted to be able to tweak it really rapidly based on what we were learning. Fun fact, we're on version 108 of our web onboarding care flow through Avela. That is how many times we've touched that care flow as we've been learning through it. And then do we have the right insight into the data to tell the story? And so when we thought about implementing this decision to expand our self-pay market, we tried to think it through as a good or best-in-class performer using this framework. And what we found was that we stood by the decision. It didn't matter what the results were. It was the right decision to test it, right? And what we found was that by offering self-pay in a large number of states, we were creating a huge top of funnel, right? We were creating a ton of lead volume, which was creating a ton of work for our team. They had to call those leads, give them information, answer questions. But we were not seeing an impact on bottom of funnel. More people were not actually signing up. And because of that care flow, because of that ability to see where people were dropping off, to see where they were coming from, to understand what our investor kill criteria were, within a month, we decided to stop pushing it. We decided to pull back on our self-pay strategy. It wasn't helping. It wasn't creating a good result. And we probably knew that 2 weeks in, but we ran it a little longer to see if we could tweak it. So it's a good example of how we tried to make decisions in a way that was aligned with sort of what we were trying to learn and move quickly, right? Versus we could have wasted a bunch of time and resources kind of continuing to work that lead volume. And so at the end of the day, if I had to boil this all down into like one line that you could take away from this, right? It's that the magic of improving care operations isn't in making big decisions that will guarantee a desired result. It's in making small decisions, and it's about working on making those decisions better every day, right? Really improving that decision-making quality and continuing to push that in the team through team alignment. That practice will improve, right? Will improve your care operations over time. And I like to end on something a little bit tangible. So I gave you some Monday morning moves, which are just things that I do in my practice, not always on Mondays, but that I think are helpful, that implement some of the things we talked about today. So the first is, can you identify one meeting that you can replace with a dashboard and async updates, right? In your final meeting, the meeting where you all agree that you're not going to have this meeting anymore, can you align on what does good look like, right? And when do we move? When do we invest? When do we adapt? And when do we kill? Because then what you're going to do is create alignment that even though we aren't coming and talking about this every week, we're going to look at the data and we're going to know every week what does good look like and when do we move? And we can make decisions based on that data. The second thing is to implement that postmortem forecast into your next initiative. I suggest focusing it on initiatives that maybe take 25 or more hours of time, right? I think that's best used for these big macro decisions that are really investment heavy. And if you don't have team buy-in, it's okay, right? You can do this framework for yourself, and you can create a decision log where you're looking at it over time and refining and improving your own decision-making processes. I think that's still a very valuable exercise and will contribute towards your influence in making better decisions at your organization. And then my last one is choose one goal for Q2. Look at your company, your team goals, look at your personal goals and say what's one goal for this quarter, and try to align it all the way up to the company's initiatives, right? And if you can't do that, I think it's a great opportunity to talk with your manager about why, right? Why are we doing this? Can we understand how does this tie back to the overall global initiatives of the organization? So I hope those are helpful, but they're just little areas that I think you can implement some of what we chatted about today.
Cool. Thanks, Kate. We have a couple more questions from the audience that I'd like to run by you. We still have 10-ish minutes, a little bit less.
Yeah.
So one question is how to create a culture of accountability while ensuring a blame-free culture, right? They can be really close to each other. And so sometimes accountability is used as kind of a word to actually throw people under the bus. So how would you approach that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we do this when we're like hyper focused on results, right? Because when someone is accountable for a specific, like initiative or goal or objective, we often judge that person's success based on the results of that initiative or objective, right? Like, well, that thing failed, so you must have done a bad job, right? And I think one of the best ways to do this is to counteract this is to remove judgment on disconnect the end result from the process, right? From the initiative itself. So like, just because something was good or bad, like, or had a perceived good or bad result, doesn't mean that the person driving that initiative necessarily did a good or bad job, right? Like, I think it's easy to assume that, but instead to say, okay, like, this is a data point, like this result is a data point that our initiative either worked or didn't work. And how can we think about what that data point told us about the way we made that decision, which we probably did as a team. It's very unlikely that like that person made that decision in a silo. And also, then we can look at implementation and say, what did we learn about how we implemented, right, that overall initiative or result. So disconnecting the result and its success or failure from the individual who was maybe in implementation, because really the result was probably more impacted by the decision-making process on the front end than the implementation itself of that individual.
Yeah, great stuff. Another one is what are the key breakpoints that happen as you scale, both from a provider perspective as well as a member perspective?
Breakpoints as in like points of failure. Do you think that's what it means?
Yeah, indeed. So the breakpoints in the operational model as you scale the number of providers on the team or as you scale the members on the team.
I mean, I don't know that I think there are like universal ones. I think it is probably unique to every organization. I think there are probably similar-ish pain points, right? Where in my experience in the beginning, you don't take shortcuts, but you like don't necessarily invest in scalability, which I think can be good because you're going to learn a lot, but also can mean like as you start to feel pressure, those like bubblegum toothpick solutions like start to friction or fissure a little bit. And so for us, like things like how easy is our clinician job, right? Like how easy is it for our clinicians to do their work every day? Maybe when you have like 2 or 3 clinicians in the beginning, it's okay if there's like more manual work in their workflows and their caseloads aren't super full, but once they start to really like get heavy, their caseloads are full, that manual work's no longer tolerable. And so what I've tried to do is be really present across the organization and identify areas that are going to break in the future. Doesn't mean I fix them right now, but you can start to see the cracks of pressure earlier on, right? And so going to our clinical team and being like, tell me like just today, what are the 3 things most annoying in your job right now, right? What are the 3 things that like, even though you're not overwhelmed yet, are driving you crazy? And I earmark those as like, okay, those are areas we need to start working into our improvement cycle, because as scale starts to come, those little annoyances are going to become deep frustrations. And so usually it's around like manual processes, broken systems, things that you're okay kind of like hacking together in the beginning, but at time, as pressure starts to come in, are going to like really dampen your ability to ramp and scale.
I love it. I love that question about the 3 things most annoying. That's really good. Maybe one last one before we sign off here from the audience. So you have examples of how you might think about results differently, so that it's not only about the initiative itself succeeding or failing, but maybe about whether you got the information. I think you referred to this at the end of your talk, Kate, where you said, how can we shape our decisions so that we have the maximum learning from the decision? I think that is what the question is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge I have for you all is to not associate, it's this concept called resulting, right? Which is like, we decide if a decision was good or bad by the result and the that comes from that decision. And the reality is that like, you may have made a great decision and there were like 5 unrelated reasons that decision ended up being a bad one, right? Like like, or that the result ended up being a quote unquote bad one, right? You might have made a really lazy, sloppy decision that didn't follow good process, that just was like, I need to go, I just made this decision. And like, you might have just gotten lucky and gotten a great result, right? Like sometimes that happens too. And so I think like it can be difficult, but I think like it's disconnecting those two things and saying like the result doesn't mean my decision was good or bad, and focusing more on how did we make that decision and how could we improve the way we make decisions in the future based on what we learned from that process. That will provide you a richer cycle of improvement than constantly being like, well, because that result was bad, I'm not ever going to make that decision again, because you're going to make incorrect like correlations, and you're going to end up actually like potentially making your decision-making process worse, or making the wrong decisions again, because you're overestimating how much control you had over the end result based on that decision-making process.
Great. Okay. Well, Kate, you gave us really literally a wealth of frameworks and questions to ask and things to think about in this less than 1 hour. So high density of stuff to try out. So big thank you to all of the audience. Also, thanks for joining. We will share the recording and maybe some snippets very soon.
Awesome. Thank you. And I am on LinkedIn. My email is just kate@joinavela.com. I love to chat about this stuff. I think it's super interesting. So please feel free to always shoot me a line if you're interested in talking more.
Thanks, Kate. Bye,
Thanks for the
everyone.
time. Bye.